o'clock, so I'll call the meeting to order. Is there anybody that has any conflict of interest or peculiar interest on the items appearing on today's agenda? I see none, so we'll carry on. Is there any amendments to the agenda, additions? I'll entertain a motion to adopt the agenda as presented. Councillor Lloyd, any discussion? All in favor? That's carried. And then we have 3.1, the regular council meeting minutes of February 11, 2019. Councillor Chapman.
Yeah, thank your worship. On item 038, which would be under information items 11.1, the comment I made about the AGM, that should be moved to the Canadian Badlands for information. I'll move to accept the minutes as amended.
Okay, Councillor Chapman has mentioned that amendment and moves them as amended. Any other discussion? Seeing none, I'll call the question. All in favor? Yeah, it's carried. Okay, and then we have, not Spencer. Are you going to present on that?
No, he's on his way, so we'll just go to 7.1.
Okay, so we have 7.1, the appointment of the census coordinator, Lana. Hi, Lana, go ahead.
Thank you, Mayor. We are conducting a census this spring from April 1st until June 30th, and we will be updating our census numbers for grants and to determine our population per capita. And as my role as census coordinator, I have to first be appointed to that.
Okay. Okay, anybody have any questions through the Lana? I believe Lana will give a more robust update and more details about what the census entails later on after she's gotten some training and whatnot, so a little bit further into the process. So today is just to get the ball rolling and make her the coordinator. So is there any questions through the Lana then, Councillor Simpson?
Oh, I was just going to make the motion to appoint Legislative Coordinator Lana Unger to the role of Census Coordinator for 2019.
Okay, thank you. Any discussion? Seeing none, I'll call the question. All in favor? Okay, that's carried. And then welcome Councillor Avery. Just as confirmation, is there anything on the agenda that would leave you in conflict or pecuniary interest today? Okay, thanks. All right. And then we'll go back to 4.1 and we have Spencer Croyle to do an update on the IDS for us. And Steve Hardy is joining them. Welcome, gentlemen.
Thank you, Mayor and members of Council. This afternoon, myself and Steve Hardy, Senior Planner with the Oldman River Regional Service Commission, will be presenting the findings of the brief technical review of the integrated development strategy that was undertaken over the past several weeks. Just as a friendly reminder, the scope of the review was focused on the following questions. Number one, what aspects of the IDS have been implemented since its completion? Number two, for those aspects of the IDS that have been implemented, to what level did detailed planning, engineering, and design deviate from the high-level guidance contained in the IDS? Number three, for those aspects of the IDS that have not been implemented either at all or in part, to what level should they be considered in planning, engineering, and design proposals and processes now and into the future? And point four was a question regarding the interpretation of the IDS as provided by the original authors of the document. The IDS is a challenging document to work with due to its makeup, in that It is part strategic and part broad concept, with enough detailed information to support the broad concepts, but with not quite enough detail to be able to apply and execute these concepts without first undertaking more thorough investigation of site-specific conditions and considerations. In fact, this is not uncommon with community planning documents. The IDS acts as a broad-reaching, bigger picture planning document would, in the sense that the goals and objectives of such a document can be more focused, but the concepts that are contained in that document can be quite preliminary in terms of the need to acquire significantly more detail before applying and executing initial concepts. Taking a step further back, this is a reality of almost all community planning documents that are prepared at the same scale as the IDS was. And this is a point that's illustrated throughout the Service Commission's findings, which I'm going to have Steve review with Council now.
Go ahead, please.
Thank you, Mayor Craig. As you've, I guess, provided in your agenda package there that we were requested by the town to undertake a review of the integrated development strategy. As well, I was around at the time that that was undertaken, so I have a little bit of personal history with the going-ons at the time that the process was undertaken. And as one of the planning advisors to Lethbridge County as well, I have a little bit of information or some personal knowledge of their perspective at the time and currently as well on that strategy. I think one of the things you do have to keep in mind is that the integrated development strategy was originally not a plan or study that was requested by either municipality. It was a private landowner, private developer driven initiative. Due to some development pressures back around 2010, 2011 in Lethbridge County on Coaldale's doorstep, some of the developers who in a sense were put off from developing in Lethbridge County due to some concerns, came forward and with the idea to do the study to try to get, in a sense, Coaldale and the county to look at their proposal, but also to kind of more broadly look at land use in the area around Coaldale. So I think one of the things you have to remember is that the study itself, most of the land that was studied actually is not in the town of Coaldale, it's in Lethbridge County. Subsequent to that, you have annexed in a little bit of that land area, but most of the land that was under study more significantly affects Lethbridge County through the study than it does, in a sense, town of Coaldale, because of the land area and the jurisdiction of that land is within Lethbridge County. The project itself, there were some discussions at the time between the two municipalities, but at the time the study was commenced, it was the idea was, and this was through the developer's proposal, was that it would be funded through at that time through the Rural Community Adaptation Program, the RCAP grant, in order to do that study. I think one of the important things to pay attention to as well is that grant is to support rural economic development. So one of the things about the study as well is just not a focus on land use and land use planning. Two of the main topics and part in order to be included on the Rural Community Adaptation Program grant was that it was an economic development focus and then looking at stormwater management between the two municipalities, stormwater management for the region. So it just wasn't land use based. The idea at the time, and when the county and the town agreed to go ahead with this private proposal to do this study, was that basically the idea was that the county and town would work together rather than maybe have competing interests in the area or through development, such as on Coaldale's doorstep. The two would try to put a framework, a kind of plan in place to kind of look at how the two could work together to solve together things such as where it might be suitable for certain types of development, such as what was going on in Lethbridge County on Highway 3 in the Broxburn area, and how that might impact Coaldale, and looking at stormwater that comes from the county into the town's stormwater, and how it all affects the Maile drainage basin and that type of a thing. So the emphasis was to say, well, how can we maybe look at the broader picture to address that kind of thing. So that was kind of the impetus for the study. So there's a few takeaways, and I didn't know if you wanted me to go through. You have the report there of each section of what was, we kind of looked at some of the different sections on stormwater, the highway corridor, and those things, transportation, what was covered or not. But, and I can do that, or certainly afterwards if you have some questions on that. But there is a couple maybe takeaways from the study that I'll highlight for you. First off, I think it has to be recognized that the IDS itself is very broad in scope and is what one would call a conceptual or concept plan. The IDS is not a statutory plan. And what I mean by that is that municipalities may by bylaw adopt statutory plans under Division 4, Part 17 of the Municipal Government Act. These include intermunicipal development plans, such as what you have with Lethbridge County, which is mandatory, municipal development plan, which you have, and the town is in the process. You're going to start updating that here soon, which is also mandatory, and then area structure plans, which are voluntary. So that's where you look at a more defined area, like West Coaldale, South Coaldale, that type of thing, where you're looking more at the neighborhood unit. Or area redevelopment plans, such as looking for a plan for downtown. Those may be adopted by the municipalities. There's certain criteria of what has to be in those plans, and those are statutory plans. So after adopting them, they have legislative status. The IDS is not this. It's not a statutory plan, and the IDS cannot be adopted in a formal sense under the Municipal Government Act by council. It does not meet the criteria for any of those other plans. So there's no legislative framework to adopt it. You can accept it, you can incorporate ideas into your other various planning documents, such as an MDP, IDP, but it, as a study, there's no requirement that either you or the county has to follow it, that developers have to follow it, and on matters such as if development wasn't and went to appeal, that type of thing, an appeal board or the Municipal Government Act, or Municipal Government Board, I should say, doesn't have to respect it or follow it either. So it's a study, it's not a statutory plan. What do we mean by a conceptual plan? A conceptual plan is based on or relates to broad ideas or concepts. Something is conceptual when it deals primarily with abstract or original thoughts, ones that are yet to be refined. A conceptual plan is one in an early stage and is quite general. To make it work, you'll need to flesh out the details. So that's the actual definition of conceptual. So what really the IDS looks at is as a strategy, looks at good planning and stormwater management practices, but is not specific enough to balance out all competing interests or provide detailed engineering analysis to address all land use issues to specific areas or parcels of land. One of the other main components of the IDS that has to be recognized as well is that there's a number of parties involved with that scope of the document and what it addresses. The town of Coaldale, Lethbridge County, obviously, and also Alberta Transportation, Highway 3 corridor, the SMRAD, Alberta Environment on the stormwater aspects, landowners who have land in the identified study area, business owners, all those types of things. So there's a number of different, sometimes competing interests as well, and trying to balance those sometimes and look at all the aspects of the various competing parties. It's a little bit difficult, and hence that's kind of the broad scale nature of the document. One of the things as well that I think that has to be considered is that when you're looking at detailed planning and municipal decision making, many factors go go into decision-making by elected officials such as yourself, especially when it comes to land use planning. Besides just looking at the plans and what the professionals, the planners, the engineers have recommended or put in their report, part of the decision-making process, elected official also looks at developer and landowner interests, costs of services, economic considerations at the time, growth constraints or possibilities, infrastructure and budgeting constraints in particular years. These may and do shift over time. And the importance of one item over another may be actually elevated or lowered through the years, but through subsequent councils too, as councils change. There's also, it has to be recognized that there's different levels of government and responsibilities, changing government legislation, finances, land ownership circumstances, which also shape in the decision-making of elected officials. Thus, any successful plan must be flexible, adaptive, and reviewed and adjusted if needed to assist the municipality moving forward and managing growth as best able. So, the IDS, as mentioned, it's a broad plan, it's a concept plan looking at land use, looking at how stormwater can be managed between Lethbridge County and the town and into the Malloy Drainage Basin. Looks at the town growth a little bit, introduces some concepts of the neighborhood community, sustainable growth, smart growth, trying to not expand your footprint as much and those types of things. But addressing all those topics is done at the very broad scale. Over time, and just to give you an example here, even in Coaldale, when I used to be the planning advisor with Coaldale between about 99, 2000, 2006, we had the West Coaldale Area Structure Plan in place, which is a statutory plan, very specific. And over just a 5 or 6 year period, that West Coaldale Area Structure Plan, I think, was changed 5 times, if I remember right. So from what the original plan was, they made some adjustments. A year or two later, developer came back, asked council for some other adjustments. And just to give you an example, the commercial area originally was very small. After a number of years, the developer asked for more commercial area in there, less residential. A few years later, it was adjusted again to kind of about half of what the original plan was between the amount of commercial to what you see out there now. The reason for that, and the reason the council of the day went through and allowed some of those changes, was that the developer had provided information to council at the time about the economic circumstances, about some of the businesses that were maybe interested in locating there or not interested, so they were adjusting the plan at the time. So a lot of, back in the late 90s, early 2000s, when growth wasn't happening as quickly as it did in Coaldale in the late 2000s, that council was trying to get some economic development going, so they're a little bit more adaptive to changing plans and circumstances because of finances and economics at the time. So that's quite normal, and that's, you see the council decisions can fluctuate, and through subsequent councils looking at financing, budgeting, developers, landowners' interests, and economic realities. So the point I guess I'm trying to make with that is that with a broad plan, once you go to implement it, that's where the boots hit the pavement. So once a plan is implemented, when you're looking at how is this going to work on the ground, what's the engineering like for servicing, what's the cost to put a pipe to run from here to over there or this other area, what are the landowners in the area, if they're willing to participate or not, that type of thing. That'll shape and sometimes change council's directions on a plan. The IDS did not have the specific engineering done, such as some things on stormwater and in town growth areas, in order to answer those questions decisively. So the IDS has a lot of good concepts in there, a lot of good planning concepts. Lethbridge County itself, as I work with Lethbridge County, is not following or looking at everything in that IDS to implement. They see a number of good ideas in it, such as the stormwater management on a regional scale, which they've been working with Coaldale on the Malloy Drainage Plan to implement that. The county made some changes to their industrial commercial land use strategy and their municipal development plan in order to concentrate the industrial business development at Broxburn more on a clustered nodal basis there rather than have it spread out all along the highway to try to protect more farmland, have some separation distance to Coaldale, that type of thing. Look at more of clustered, what we call cluster type development. Lethbridge County has been supporting the bicycle path and the trail linkage between Coaldale and the city of Lethbridge and has been working on supporting some of that. So certain aspects they've been incorporating into their documents. There's also some aspects of the plan that they didn't necessarily agree with or that they've decided through their own decision making not to fully pursue or support type of a thing. So some of those that they have, we've been implementing through their municipal development plan and some of their other planning documents to see them come to fruition. A couple of the key goals of the IDS is that because it is such at a broad conceptual scale, is that the town of Coaldale, just like Lethbridge County, has to decide how you want to implement it, what's important you to implement, what are your core values and goals on that. So really documents to be used to inform land use planning and decision making, how you want to incorporate that or incorporate in your upcoming MDP that you'll be preparing. The main components of the IDS, which has been looking at the stormwater on a regional basis with the county, has been undertaken already. You guys have a partnership with the county, you're working away on that. And as you move forward here, you know, some additional engineering and other planning studies will have to be done to decide how you might want to implement some of that. I suspect, like any council, some of that will be based on upcoming finances and budgeting concerns and that sort of stuff as you move forward. So this is all good information for you to consider in your decision making. So with that, we did do the review, which our office went through and looked at some of the main issues that were identified in that IDS. We tried to identify for you of where you're at, what some stuff's been implemented, some stuff that hasn't, even perhaps why some stuff hasn't. For instance, on the stormwater component, the engineer who worked on that was out of Ontario. They had some information there about reusing stormwater. That's something that's not allowed in Alberta under the legislation, so it simply legally just cannot be done, at least at this point, until the provincial legislation changes. So Ontario has a little bit of different rules on the water use than what Alberta does, but just as a note, the engineer who did that component had more of an Ontario background than he had an Alberta background. So some of those components, even though it sounds good in practice and it sounds like a good idea, technically right now the county or the town of Coaldale can't do that. As mentioned, the regional pathway system is something that has started to be initiated. There's a committee. Lethbridge County has committed a little bit of funding to start off. So that is something that's underway. The section on the town growth, smart growth for the town, that was introduced in the IDS as a very broad concept of a best planning practice, but actually the consultant who worked on that aspect was trying to get more of the idea of looking at neighborhood communities and how those develop, and that's a practice to follow for the town rather than identify specific lands or areas, how that would actually come about. When the town has to implement something here through upcoming MDP and subsequent area structure plans, when you're looking at a new area, or perhaps at some of your annexed areas, that's where you'll implement, if you choose to, some of those more specifics at that level and where you look at engineering, where pipes must connect and run and that stuff to hook up to your sewer and water system, and where stormwater ponds need to go. That level of detail was not looked at in the IDS. So the concept is the neighborhood community, about looking at walking distances, higher density, all that sort of stuff, is something that you would address through those subsequent stages. One of the things that some people forget too, I like to point out, is that, you know, as Coaldale's evolved from the 40s and the 50s and the 60s, town of Coaldale is not unlike other communities in Western Canada and Alberta here, where you've been based on what we call a suburban design, where you had large lots, cul-de-sac streets, those types of things, which the focus on planning over the last number of years is to go to higher density development, limit your footprint of going out type of a thing. But because a lot of the existing blocks and streets and infrastructure in Coaldale is based on the old larger suburban design in the 50s and 60s, that's not something that you can just flick a switch and implement overnight. It's going to take years of redevelopment plans, looking at infill, working with the neighbors in the neighborhoods. Some people are opposed to such things, some people are supportive, but it'll be done in bits and pieces here and there through your plans through the years, and it's not something that can magically stroke of adopting a plan and it's done overnight, because your current town is not designed that way, just like most communities aren't. You even see in the big cities, places like Calgary, which are really struggling with trying to intensify their downtown area and add higher density. And some neighbors who lived there for many years are opposed to it and that sort of a thing. So it's a very delicate planning process that takes many years to implement. As well, and the review also looked at some of the water and wastewater transportation components as well. Similarly, some of those have started to be implemented on some of the studies you've done, some of your engineering studies on wastewater. As well, those are things that have to be done over years, and as budgeting allows and those types of things. The transportation concept is really a matter for Alberta Transportation, especially the Highway 3 corridor, because that part is under their jurisdiction. You know, the town of Coaldale and Lethbridge County are often consulted or involved with Alberta Transportation, but Alberta Transportation has the final say on actually how that transportation planning along Highway 3 actually rolls out. So with that, I say I won't go through all the details. You do have in your package. If there's any questions, I can try to answer them. But what we did try to do for you and keep it kind of layman's terms and kind of do a brief overview is take a bunch of those components the IDS did look at and try to go through to say, well, what's happening in Coaldale? What have you done? You know, where can you still go type of thing if some of these components you want to look at or include. But again, with the IDS, really introducing a number of concepts or good planning practices and that sort of a thing. It will be you as council to decide, you know, moving forward, which one of those or how or all of them do you want to steer into your other subsequent planning documents, whether it be your municipal development plan or any subsequent IDP updates with Lethbridge County or through subsequent area structure plans and that sort of a thing. It's not approve a plan and go out the door and get to work on it. These are policy initiatives presented in here that you take and you put into your other documents of what you see that is important on things.
If I may, Mr. Mayor, I just have a few final comments to make prior to moving on to the question element of the presentation, if that's all right. Well, with that, I'll steal the mouse from the front. I may end up repeating very briefly a couple of points that Steve has made, so I'll try to avoid that as best I can. Just a couple of closing remarks. Throughout the IDS, there are recommendations to translate the goals and objectives of the strategy into statutory documents, or to bring some of those goals and objectives into what would make up goals and objectives in statutory documents that we may consider, such as the town's municipal development plan, or what we are now calling the town plan. There's a recommendation to create plans such as stormwater master plans, and to have more detailed work done on the spectrum of topics covered in the IDS. Quickly referencing a few examples from the recent past, I'd like to present a brief set of slides and demonstrate how additional study has translated and refined elements of the IDS into reality in and around Coaldale. So number one is from the community planning and growth study perspective. The growth study that was completed in 2015 included discussion about topics that Steve has referenced: the neighborhood unit, complete communities, and smart growth. That was referenced in the growth study, and those were all elements informed by the IDS itself. The annexation application that was completed in 2017 and approved by the province in 2018 moved the idea forward, the idea of the neighborhood unit and introducing complete communities to Coaldale's future urban development patterns at some point. By virtue of shifting focus from potentially annexing multiple unsubdivided irrigated quarter sections, as we see where I've got my mouse now, by shifting from a focus in that area near the southwest to drawing a relatively finite line along the western border of the new Coaldale, the idea of a complete community in the northwest of Coaldale could be achieved. And so now, instead of having future Coaldale in these areas, as council I'm sure is well aware, by virtue of the fact that we want to minimize the annexation and development of unsubdivided irrigated quarter sections, we only have one unsubdivided irrigated quarter section in the new town boundary. The rest of the property in the northwest is subdivided and fragmented by highways and other rights of way that would lend it to be more suitable for future growth from a broad philosophical perspective that the county and the town share, and that we essentially have to support by virtue of the fact that the provincial land use policies indicate agriculture is the highest and best use of unsubdivided irrigable quarter sections. Indeed, the annexation application moved the idea forward, and there's an added benefit that information that wasn't available in the 2012 IDS for this intersection in particular, which is Highway 3 and 30th Street, information from a 2016 transportation or traffic impact assessment that had to be completed at the request of Alberta Transportation due to a lot of the new growth that we see on the west side of Coaldale. McDonald's, Home Hardware, those types of businesses that have made the choice to locate here. That type of development has driven the need for signalization at this intersection by 2026, and that is regardless of any future growth to the north. So really, one of the added benefits of being able to grow in the northwest and create a more complete community in the northwest, as we've been clear about since the annexation application, is the fact that we have infrastructure we have to put in place anyway that will help to make the connection between the north and south as good as it can be. I'll reference a couple of other images. I think I might have these out of order, so please bear with me. What we have in front of us now is more focused on stormwater management. So this is the detailed master plan for the build out of the wetlands that would be a part of the Molloy Phase 2A area. So Molloy Phase 2A is constructed, as we all know, where we see the mouse now, and the future footprint based on elevations, soil conditions, and a lot of historic observation through aerial imagery and historic information that we have all the way back to the early 1900s indicates that this really is the highest and best use of these areas at some point in the future, given their historic relevance as by and large historic wetlands. So I'll just show a couple of images. This one shows the footprint of wetlands that are largely not there today because they were filled in and as development occurred in the north of Coaldale. But these areas kind of inform the fact that where we've put Phase 2A of the Molloy is, for the most part, where it should go. And then from there we look further north. there's really no indication that lands west of the Phase 2A area would be suitable for wetlands or the construction of wetlands. We have another map from April 2015 that shows through, was this one LiDAR as well? Through LiDAR imagery, which is, I'm sure Council is aware of the term, but again, LiDAR imagery identified where water is most likely to pool. Again, this is an evidence-based way of kind of ground proofing where wetlands have been and where they might be best suited in the future. Again, we see that the quarter section, actually all three of the whole or fragmented quarter sections that make up the future neighborhoods in the northwest of Coaldale as per the annexation approval are not areas where you would expect to find pooling. And then we have additional historic imagery that shows, again, there's really no evidence of pooling in the northwest of Coaldale where we're considering future growth. And finally, I just wanted to close with an illustration that shows the quarter section directly west of the existing wetlands where we've just constructed our new wetlands. And again, our sediment treatment pond is kind of where the mouse isn't really cooperating right now, but it's kind of in the area where we see that small amount of pooling, which is really the only area on the quarter section where there is evidence of pooling other than in the far northwest, which is, or northeast, sorry, which is again where we would expect to see pooling now that we've put a catchment area there. And really the point of this is all just to demonstrate that while the concepts from the IDS are an excellent starting point, reviewing resources such as historic imagery, soil conditions, and other information have helped to identify the exact footprint of constructed wetlands and catchment infrastructure needed to be, and all of which needed to be adjusted significantly prior to these facilities being built. And the hope is that the more detailed information we have will continue to lead the design process when we expand those wetlands in the northwest. So in closing, just a couple of additional comments. Translating concepts through the collection and detailed review of additional information into reality, as I've just shown, is exactly how the IDS has been used up to this point. And from this point forward, one thing that I think I might be able to do a better job of is to be as clear as I can be regarding if, how, and when current and future projects may have relevance to the IDS. To that point, I can be clear this afternoon about one thing. The IDS does have good, innovative, thoughtful concepts and goals and objectives and recommendations within it, all of which need to be studied further and refined prior to applying in the context of changes that have occurred since 2012 and the new information and resources we have available to us that were not available during the development of that document. So with that, of course, we're happy to take any comments. I'll just close by indicating that at this point, I don't know that there's any real benefit to the continued consideration of the IDS by changing the motion that was originally made in February of 2012 or 2013. I'm speaking faster than I can think. So it was February 13th, 2012. And just for council's sake, the motion reads that Councillor Chapman moved that council receives the Integrated Development Strategy final report as a strategic document, elements of which can be used to guide policy and program development in Coaldale. And further, that council refers the study back to the Joint Steering Committee to oversee the development of an implementation framework to identify and prioritize actions related to the IDS. We are essentially doing this and have been doing this up to this point and will continue to do this, especially with reference to how we can think of working with the county, the larger partner in the whole document, as to whether or how or if or when or why they decide to continue implementing parts of it as we move into the future. Thank you.
On behalf of council, I want to thank both of you gentlemen for such a thorough and complete report and all the analysis that has gone into it, and plus all the people that work with you on that as well. And one of the tenets of the IDS was to shift our focus on treating stormwater as a liability more and consider it more as an asset. And I believe what the work that has done subsequent to the IDS has proven that, that's the mentality and the philosophy that we've adopted by engineered wetlands and what have you. And another major asset that I see fell out of the IDS is our wonderful partnership with the three partners, the county and SMRD. So we've realized huge benefits by what the IDS has shaped by putting us all in the same room and considering those principles as well. So at this point in time, I'll open up the floor to any questions or comments that my colleagues might have.
Thank you, Worship. I'd like to concur completely with every word you said and your closing statement there. And I think that this exercise over the past 15 years or so has been, or if it's that long, has been very detailed. And from my point of view, I think the two takeaways that I remember from it, obviously, were one, the stormwater management issue, but I think primary to the town of Coaldale being is that we were closed circuited at that time with stormwater management, and that was the fact that in the day that any water that crossed the boundary line of the town of Coaldale became Coaldale's property or responsibility and accountable for, and nobody else's. So this was really kind of a stimulus to kind of build that partnership, as the mayor has pointed out. But one of the big takeaways was the neighborhood unit concept, and to me that was something that really was not very logical or very doable in our historical way of building communities. But even looking to the future wasn't a logical plan for the town of Coaldale to undertake. The one question I do have for you on page 3 of 30, you're talking the first sentence. You're speaking to the point that it is recommended that the guiding principles and recommendations from the IDS be carried forward to the town plan for review or rewrite process. Is that something you'll be undertaking to carry forward as sort of high-level fundamental points, Spencer?
Through the chair to Councillor Chapman, yes, that was the intent. I purposely didn't go into a great level of detail with the recommendation for council. Again, given that I don't personally see any benefit to changing the motion that was made in 2012, but of course the IDS will be a topic of discussion and has already been studied in a way that will help to have it inform and be discussed as part of the town plan review.
Any other subsequent questions or comments by council? Would anybody care to make a motion then?
If not, yes, I'll make that motion, Your Worship, that council received this report and all attachments as information.
I have a motion by Councillor Chapman. Any discussion? Seeing none, I'll call the question. All in favor? Yeah, it's carried unanimously. Thank you. Thank you again, Spencer and Steve.
Thank you.
We're up to item 7.2, Palliser Busing Partnership. Kyle.
Good afternoon. So in front of you have the Palliser busing agreement proposed busing agreement for 2019-2020. A couple key highlights on changes. So we sell 100 bus passes a year. That has remained the same. Fees go from $245 to $250 per bus pass. And the town of Coaldale cost has increased from $11,500 to $11,850 to supplement that service. See if there's any questions from this agreement, and if not, looking for the agreement to be approved.
Thank you, Kyle. Councillor Chapman, you have a question?
I do, Your Worship. Thank you. Kyle, thank you for this report and recommendation. I guess my question to you would be, and maybe Dexter Durfee's already answered it to a large degree. He's probably knows the demographics for the town and what the prospects are for this coming fall. And I guess leading up to that with our census, do you think that will affect any changes even for this fall?
Just not clear on the question.
I guess I'm looking at is the future, and the 100 passengers that you're budgeting for this year. I'm just wondering if that might be a little lean, whether we may need to update that number, say even to 120, just
Yeah.
for well-rounded figures.
The bus passes, they do sell out every year relatively quickly, so even at this current level, there's still probably excess demand rather than capacity now. As far as increasing capacity, I'm not sure what Palliser has available to do that. That's something I could look into, but I don't know if they have those options right now to increase capacity.
Councillor Simpson next.
Thank you, Your Worship. Just a question on this. Do we have any statistics, or does Palliser have any statistics on how many people actually take the bus, not how many passes are actually sold? Just wonder if we couldn't possibly be a little bit like an airline here and oversell a bunch of the seats, because it's my understanding from some people in town that, well, they line up very quickly to get their bus pass for their kids, but the kids only take the bus half a dozen times a year when they need to, because the parents drive them to school anyways, but they want to make sure they get their bus pass. So I'd hate to have a bus that's fully sold out, but only have an occupancy of 60 or 70%.
That's something I could look into talking to Dexter about Palliser and get that information.
Okay, and Councillor Simpson.
I know for the busing for Councillor Holmes' statement, I've heard a lot of that and I've seen a lot of that, but I do know the buses are pretty full. So at least from what my kids have experienced and their friends have experienced. But last year when this letter came out from Palliser, there was a lot of questions, especially for the people that are past that 2.4 kilometers. Is there a way we could talk to Palliser and ask them to reword their lettering, that if right now you're past that 2.4 and you're covered for busing? Because I took a lot of phone calls, and I know the town and I know Palliser took a lot of phone calls of people unsure about how that was worded last year. So I'm just wondering if we could reword it so the people that are already covered over that 2.4 know they are.
Just to
So
have
they-
a little more clarity.
Yeah,
into-
yeah, that's exactly.
Yeah, I can look into that.
Any additional comments or questions? Seeing none, I consider a motion if anybody so wish to put one forward. Councillor Lloyd, you move the recommendation that council approve the 2019-2020 busing agreement with Palliser Regional Schools? Okay. Any discussion? Councillor Chapman?
Thank you, Worship. Maybe just ask Kyle that along with this motion, that it could be reviewed in, even in September, as to see what not only the capacity issues are, but also what the number of applications have been. If you've only put out 100 and 100 people come, are there 120 or 30, or what the excess number might be?
Thank you, Councillor Chapman. So I will, in all these other points too, I will follow up on these and bring these back to council once we have further information on and make the requested changes.
Okay, so the motion still stands as read out. So any other discussion with respect to the motion as read out by? If not, I'll call the question. All in favor? Yeah, that's carried unanimously. Thank you very much, Kyle.
Thanks.
And then item 7.3, AUMA, the president of AUMA reached out with an email and requested municipalities support the initiative of Resource Communities of Canada to focus on the importance of the resource sector in our economy. So I think it's quite explanatory in the report and that. So bring it forward to council to see if you would be supportive of supporting this initiative by AUMA. Are there any questions? We have the two recommendations, the resolution of council or receive for information. Does anybody care to support either one? Councillor Chapman?
But I think your sense of the confidence of the AUMA's position is very strong, so I'll make the motion that that we support option number 1.
Okay, thank you very much. We have Councillor Chapman supporting option number 1, moving that we adopt that. Is there any discussion? You seeing none, I'll call the question. All in favor? Okay, and that's carried unanimously, I believe. Thank you very much. And then we have 8.1. We have the development stats report in the package. Is there any comments or questions? It's regrettably kind of small, but I guess with the winter we've had, it's kind of hard to dig holes in the permafrost right now. Councillor Simpson.
Make a motion to receive for information.
Okay, any discussion? Call the question, all in favor? Okay, and that's carried unanimously, thank you. Then we have section 11, and I just want to make a highlight of the funding that we received through item 11.7, the $1,021,000 grant on the Malloy Drain Phase 2B project. And on behalf of council, want to thank all the members of administration and the collaboration between the three parties, SMRD and the county, for making that possible. We're hopeful that maybe our illustrious Prime Minister and the federal government will support this initiative as well, and that we could commence the development of Phase 2B in the near future. And reading further down, the next item down is very important as well, because both these items together really bode well for the management of storm water within our footprint with the spillway project that the MD of Tabor, I believe that we actually sent a letter of support for their grant application as well. So I think that with those two projects really enhances our ability to deal with stormwater in the future, and so that is really good news to see this one. With that, I'll close off my comments and want to open it up to if anybody has any other information on any of the other information items within that section, or speak further to 11.7. Councillor Holm.
Speak to 12.7 here just a little bit. We did have a meeting on the Regional Stormwater Committee this morning again. Yes, the Tabor Horsefly Spillway was approved the $7.4 million. They're very confident that there will be, that ends up being 33.3% of the cost of that project. They're very confident that because of that being covered by the province, that the federal government will also support to an additional 40%. So that would bring us up to 73% of the project should be covered by grants. At least there's a very strong expectation of that. And if that happens, then of course the final 17%, or 27%, sorry, has to come from neighboring municipalities and counties that are directly impacted by this. So one of the questions that they were asking is that I think a letter was sent out a while ago asking for municipal assessment from the town of Coaldale. And I would like to ask that that municipal assessment be sent to Derek Kazan, because they're going to be looking at dividing up that, works out to about $12.7 million. One of the ideas of splitting that cost is looking at the total assessment of all the lands, basically from south of Raymond, all along the main canal, all the way to Medicine Hat. So our assessment, we might think, is huge dollar figure, but I think in the whole landscape of things, it's not going to be very large. But I do believe that we have to be part of this group. And if that's the direction that they go, is to split it up by assessment, I think we need to provide that number to them as soon as we can. They're hoping to have it by March 20th. Yeah, I think that's the basis of what I need to say that, because a lot of this funding is going to be, and especially the 40% coming up from federal, and hopefully Malloy Drain Part 2 will also get some federal funding, is going to be based on all these partnerships. So if one of the communities or one of the counties decides to opt out of it, it's going to have a big impact on how this whole funding source comes about. So I think we all have to play in the same sandbox here. And from a town's perspective, if it costs us, I don't know, $100,000 or $200,000 additional from the dollars that we've already received in protecting our town with this Malloy Drain Phase 1 and Phase 2, et cetera, I think it's peanuts compared to what we've already received in support for this whole big project. So hopefully we can support it as we go forward. We won't have an ask for probably another 2 or 3 months.
Okay, thank you, Councillor Holm. I would just assume that you've also been a good voice at the table referencing the good work that we've done, because obviously the different projects we've done within and around the town of Coaldale also probably mitigated some of the impact on the downstream as well. So I know that I think it's only fair to be a regional partner in this as well, but hopefully the historic work that Coaldale's done on stormwater management will be considered as well.
Yeah, well, certainly. It certainly has been included in all the discussions, et cetera, et cetera. Again, when you start looking at the small part of Coaldale, between here and Medicine Hat is a pretty small volume of water, but it has certainly been put forward on the table as to what's already been contributed.
Thank you. Okay, anybody care to speak to any other items, or would you be prepared to entertain a motion to receive all the items within 11.1 to 11.7 for information? Thank you very much. Any discussion? Seeing none, I'll call the question. All in favor? Okay, that's carried. And then we've concluded the public part of the meeting, and I'll entertain a motion to go into closed session. Councillor Simpson moves. All in favor? And that's carried. Thank you.
If anybody wants to have an idea of what kind of landscape we're looking at, let's pass this around, but it's basically all the colored area would be part of this assessment.